Okay, everybody. This is part two of South Africa and the decolonization process. And part two picks up where the part one ended at the end of apartheid. And we're going to bring the story up to the current events and the current trends and big issues in South Africa today. And we ended the last class on the role of race and class and how determinative that is of how people's lives move in South Africa. And we've seen this all throughout this FYS, that investing in human capital and moving people up Maslow's hierarchy, the more that you can do that, the better society you have. In South Africa, excuse me, is a really good example of what happens when a government doesn't invest in human capital and doesn't invest in housing and education and transportation and water and healthcare, and leaves that to people to fend for themselves, and simultaneously concentrates the bulk of the wealth in all the different ways that wealth can take form in a minority of the population, and all the politics of resentment and the anger and the corruption that ensues from that situation. So the question that this lecture is trying to address, there's two of them. Number one, how does any nation such as South Africa reconcile and then adequately heal after 300 years of cruelty, neglect, prejudice, discrimination, legal and systemic unfairness, and theft? I mean, how do you move forward? What kind of justice do you achieve? What kind of redistribution do you try to manage? How do you do it? How much can you do? How can you get a more fair and equitable distribution of all the wealth in a society so that you have a bigger middle class and a stable political system? And to get there, question number two, how do you provide victims with justice and compensation? How do you right the wrongs while also moving forward into a new political existence without so threatening the existing power brokers and those who run the system? How do you get them to find some way to hand off to the majority? How do you do that peacefully? How do you avoid violence? How do you make it happen at all? And one of the mechanisms they used in South Africa after apartheid was ended was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This approach to dealing with all the crimes against humanity that occurred during apartheid is in contrast to, for say, example, the Nuremberg trials after World War II. In the Nuremberg trials, there was a law enforcement judicial prosecution of human rights abuses and crimes against humanity that the Nazis waged. And as many people as they could hold accountable, they did. They gathered evidence. They went through trials. They provided due process. They convicted many Nazis and executed many Nazis. That model, a Nuremberg model, it was concluded that would not be appropriate for South Africa, wouldn't work. Some of the thinking about that was that people who wanted that kind of reconciliation and then wanted that kind of reckoning, a judicial law enforcement response to the decades of apartheid, the thinking was they would not be able to obtain the necessary evidence, number one, because the people that committed the atrocities were the ones who had the evidence and they weren't going to give that up. Number one. Number two, there were just so many people responsible at some level or another for apartheid that it would be impossible to hold all of them accountable. It was the entire government. It was the entire police force. It was the entire intelligence service. So instead, they opted for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whereby anybody who had committed a crime during apartheid could come apply for amnesty so that they could never be prosecuted in the future, provided that they gave an extensive, comprehensive explanation of what they had done. They didn't have to show remorse. They didn't have to show sorrow or forgiveness. They just had to explain what they had done and lay it all out in detail. And the thinking was that this was the only thing that you could actually achieve. You weren't going to be able to do a Nuremberg type reckoning. That was not even going to be possible, number one. Number two, this would provide some healing, not complete healing, maybe definitely not enough healing, but there were so many families in South Africa who never knew what the truth was. Their children or loved ones disappeared and there was never any closure on it. And the hope was that if more of this came out and there were more admissions of what had happened, at least the families and the people that were traumatized could get some measure of healing. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the one who was in charge of organizing these meetings that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission held in South Africa, but also outside of South Africa. They held one in London because there were many people who had left South Africa and who had participated in apartheid, and they were no longer living in South Africa. So you had to go find them in different parts of the world. Reason number two that South Africa is so interesting to so many people is the example that Nelson Mandela set as the first president of majority rule democracy in South Africa. Inspired by his studying of history and his conviction that rulers who don't ever step down become corrupt and their regimes become corrupt, Nelson Mandela voluntarily relinquished his office after a single 5-year term, and he could have ruled until he died. He was probably the most popular political figure on the planet, but he was so ethical and so committed to clean government and clean, non-corrupt administration that he led by example and stepped down after one term, which is in stark contrast to so many of the other African leaders who have stayed on for 10, 20, 30 plus years, in part because of the corruption and crimes that go on under their regime. They become more and more concerned that they're going to be prosecuted if they leave office, which hence makes them want to stay in office even longer. And Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe is a classic example of someone who started off as a freedom fighter, becomes the leader of Zimbabwe, and then is only barely pushed out towards the end of his life after 36 years. Meanwhile, the country is decimated economically and corruption runs rampant. Nelson Mandela was trying to set a much more inspiring example, and one that said that he didn't want South Africa to be ruled by iconic individuals. He wanted a system. He wanted a model that would work more or less regardless of who the president was. So who is the prime minister or president of Denmark? Most people don't know. I don't even know. But I know Denmark has good, non-corrupt, transparent government. And that goes on year after year after year, more or less, regardless of who is in office. He's followed by Thabo Mbeki, who is more technocratic and analytical and intellectual and introverted, and was, by all accounts, fairly ethical and not given over to much corruption, which is good. The downside is he didn't address some of the major nagging problems, didn't even really give it a serious policy consideration. There was a lot of unemployment under apartheid, and there's still a lot of unemployment to this day. He didn't go after corruption both in society or in the ANC, and he didn't do a whole lot to rein in the level of violent crime. And those things are sort of held against him, more or less. The thing that's most held against him, the thing that probably ended his presidency a year early, was his bizarre, unfounded belief that AIDS was not connected to HIV. He did not believe in the link between HIV and AIDS and thought that was sort of fake news or a conspiracy theory. And hence he banned antiretroviral drugs in public hospitals, which led to the premature deaths of roughly 350,000 individuals, give or take. He stood alone in that very unscientific and disastrous position, and it had a profound impact on overall life expectancy in South Africa, which was decimating all parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but some places much worse than others. And you can see, even during difficult apartheid times, South Africa's life expectancy overall was gently increasing. And then right when apartheid is ended, it's increasing more rapidly. And then it takes this huge 10-year dip, a 10-year fall in life expectancy. You only see dips in aggregate life expectancy numbers like this if something really big has hit, like a pandemic, which we're currently going through right now. Only pandemics and really big outbreaks of disease, the 1918 influenza, can knock down and move the needle that much on life expectancy in that many people. And it happened in South Africa, and it was avoidable. Reason number three, South Africa is so interesting to so many researchers, and as from a public health perspective, few countries have suffered more from HIV/AIDS than South Africa, and I think you could actually place South Africa at the top of the list of countries that have been decimated by AIDS. Overall prevalence rates of adults with HIV/AIDS is over 15% in South Africa. There are individual regions of South Africa that have experienced prevalence rates of HIV/AIDS in adults as high as 33%, which is nowhere else on earth have we ever gotten that high. 1 in 3 adults testing positive for HIV/AIDS. Truly astonishing and truly extraordinarily destructive. That coupled with high rates of tuberculosis, you put those two together, the highest rates of HIV/AIDS and some of the highest rates of tuberculosis in the world, you put those together, and that had a very big impact on lowering life expectancy. And you can see in this graph, income on the x-axis, per capita income, poor. Down here you have low per capita income. On the right side you have high per capita income. These are wealthy countries, poor countries. And then how does that impact, or how is that correlated with life expectancy? And you get the obvious gradient that being wealthier overall leads to longer life expectancy. And then you can almost draw a regression line right through here. And some countries get higher life expectancy than their income would, their per capita income would suggest. Some places, Russia, they underperform in life expectancy, and they don't get the life expectancy that their wealth levels would suggest that they have. And then you look at South Africa and Botswana and Swaziland, and you see how bad the HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis epidemics have been there, that these are wealthier countries that should be higher in life expectancy by 10, 15 years, and they were knocked down that far. Okay, so in many ways, you can refer to the Thabo Mbeki reign as a lost decade due to HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis. And then the second lost decade, which just ended, was under Jacob Zuma. And I could go on and on. You can read a lot about him. Jacob Zuma is about the most polar opposite type of leader from Nelson Mandela as can be possibly imagined. He is facing hundreds of legal challenges and lawsuits and prosecutions since he's left office. He's been accused of rape. He's a polygamist. And I would struggle to come up with a leader in the world that is as corrupt as Jacob Zuma was. And he and his cronies and his allies that enabled this literally looted the country. He comes into office, GDP growth grinds to a halt, public debt skyrockets, GDP per person, the growth that was occurring in the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, completely stalls. There's no economic growth during the Jacob Zuma period of rule. And as one ANC activist summed it up in the book, one day you wake up, look around, and realize that everything is broken, that your country has been stolen, and not by the old white apartheid evil rulers, but by your fellow ANC allies. I mean, this has been, the ANC has ruled uninterrupted since 1994. You used to be able to blame apartheid. It was legitimate. It was the reason that explained the disparities and the inequalities and the suffering. But in the last 25 years, it's all squarely on the ANC. This is Jacob Zuma's personal residence built at taxpayer expense. More examples of corruption. I don't know who's watching this remembers the 2010 World Cup, the first World Cup in the African continent. So many reasons to get excited about that, and it was a very thrilling World Cup. It's actually the World Cup that I sort of associate with my personal growing interest in soccer, like so many other people. Loved it, celebrated it, thought it was wonderful until I watched this documentary and did some research for this lecture, and you realize, oh my God, that's me, and that's not actually me, but that's how excited I was for that World Cup. Once you looked at the numbers and you realized all of these stadiums, like this one in Cape Town and Johannesburg and Pretoria, they were all built with public revenues. That one stadium there could have built God knows how many schools and hospitals and roads and homes for South Africans, but it didn't. It was that money was siphoned off from public revenues to build these stadiums that to this day are seldom, if ever, used. And some of them are just decaying. They're these big white elephants that are monuments to corruption. Eskom, the electricity producer in South Africa, under apartheid, it still managed to provide electricity all day and sometimes surpluses. But due to 25 years of ANC leadership, of corrupt crony leadership of entities like Eskom, it is common now to have rolling blackouts in periods of the day in South Africa where regions don't have electricity. And that's a clear sign of of administrative and governmental incompetence. You can't even provide the basics of electricity and water, food, shelter, clothing, and healthcare and education. You remember this slide from our discussion in Myanmar? The oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors. In a nutshell, that describes what the ANC has become. The ANC was the freedom fighter party that pushed back on apartheid and battled apartheid, and were noble and heroic and sacrificed a lot on a personal level. And then they come into office, and over the last 2.5 decades become as corrupt as the regime they were resisting in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's gotten so bad up to the last election that ANC leaders were killing each other, trying to avoid indictments for corruption or trying to outcompete their competitors. You just kill them. That's how violent it's become. The ANC has become a violent party. The ANC is killing itself. One of the few ANC activists who was speaking out openly about the specific cases of corruption and violence, it's like a pig that's eating its own piglets. And as you read in the article, the complex legacy of vigilantism in South Africa. Violence in South Africa is at a very high level. It's one of the most violent nations on earth. And even that violence has a complicated legacy because during apartheid, there was a certain heroicness to the violent resistance of apartheid. And the ANC and others would occasionally resort to violent resistance of the violence being visited upon them. And so, that outlet, that use of violence continues to this day. What's garnered a lot of attention is that a lot of that violence has been directed at women. And we have our Me Too movement that has gathered momentum and had a huge impact in the United States. This is its own kind of movement, a similar movement in South Africa that it's actually enhanced because the focus is on preventing murderous violence against women, not just sexual exploitation, but this is outright heinous violence. Much of this stems from the fact that South Africa is literally the most unequal country on the planet. It has the greatest gulf between the wealthy, who are small in number, and the vast majority who are poor. Its Gini coefficient is the highest. And the younger generation, they're referred to as South Africa's born free generation. These are all the young adults born after 1994, in their 20s and 30s now. Many of them in college are just absolutely exasperated. It's so frustrated to the point of rage, because what they've come to realize is that the political apartheid was eliminated and removed, but economic apartheid has never been eradicated or addressed or changed. And so the richest 10, 20% of the country owns more than half of all the wealth, and the bottom 80% is all varying degrees of poor. And they are agitated and revolting. And this sign, says it all. You can read it. Post-apartheid racist society says you are poor because you're uneducated. Go get a degree. Colonial elitist universities say you are too poor to take yourself out of poverty. So a lot of young adults in South Africa feel like they can't win for losing. The system is actually there to thwart them. They can't afford. They can now go to these universities, but they can't afford it. And if they take out loans to get through these universities, there's no jobs waiting for them on the other end. So the system is so corrupt that it defies responsible individual behavior. Back in 2015 and 16, there were widespread student protests that some of them got violent all throughout the country, such that I believe the University of Richmond had to evacuate a couple of students or just bring them back mid-semester because the violence got so high. And for this generation, what they're asking for is the next transition. Again, the first one was political transition to majority rule. The end of apartheid, the election of Mandela was the first transition to majority rule. The second one is the ending of economic apartheid and a more equitable distribution of the wealth of the country. Part of that also, that decolonization, has to do with monuments. And we have an interesting phenomenon that's similar to this in the United States of Civil War statues that many people want to take down because they're offensive to African Americans who have to walk past statues that commemorate people that enslaved their great-great-grandparents. There's a similar dynamic in South Africa of statues to former white leaders, in this instance, Cecil Rhodes, of the famous Rhodes Scholarship, who made his mass fortune using slave labor in Africa to mine diamonds and gold. And he gave the money for the Rhodes Scholarship. He also gave the bulk of the money to form the very famous University of Cape Town. And now that the students at the University of Cape Town are majority Black, they don't want to walk past this statue every day and be reminded of the legacy and the history of their country. So they've petitioned and agitated for this statue to be removed, which was. The statue was relocated. And that's Cecil Rhodes, who made his fortune. And one of his primary motivators in politics and business was his professed belief that the Anglo-Saxon race was destined to greatness, as, to quote his will, the first race in the world. Under the reasoning that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race, he advocated vigorous settler colonialism and ultimately a reformation of the British Empire, so that each component would be self-governing and represented in a single parliament in London. A movement began in 2015 to have these statues removed from the University of Cape Town. And when our semester at sea ship docked in Cape Town, my class's comparative politics field trip was to the University of Cape Town to meet with Professor Shosi Kessie and her class. And Professor Kessie was one of the faculty mentors, supporters, liaisons for the students at the University of Cape Town who were pushing for the removal of these statues. And she explained that, you know, it's insulting to this generation to say that everything is open and available and that their futures are now unlimited because apartheid's gone, when every day they bump into all of these less visible forms of economic apartheid, and that those have to be rooted out. They're not going to root themselves out, right? The economic apartheid is not just going to dissolve on its own. There are people and individuals who benefit from the status quo, and no one's going to willingly just give up their resources and privilege. So you have to find ways to highlight this level of inequality and advocate for fairer policies moving forward. We finished meeting at the University of Cape Town. This is just an interesting note. We went to the most famous garden in Cape Town, the company's garden, for a meal, and we were walking out and walked right past another statue of Cecil Rhodes. So they got rid of the statue of Cecil Rhodes at the University of Cape Town, but he's still represented in statues elsewhere in the city. One form of wealth is land, how much land you own and what the land produces. In South Africa, as you read, when at the height of apartheid, 10 to 15% of the population happened to be white, owned 80 to 85% of the land. And you can see this so visually in these famous drone photos of parts of Cape Town. These are the Black squatter settlements. And then literally there's a wall that runs down here. And on the other side of the wall is basically a different country. It's another place that might as well be Australia or Canada. This is where all the white middle class live. They have athletic fields and pools and large homes. And on the other side are settlements that are literally unchanged from the apartheid era. Just some more photos of showing these middle class communities over here, and then across the highway. So there's not even a wall to separate this. You can see this when people come out from these settlements to go to work. They see this every day. It's unchanged from when apartheid was in place. That was Johannesburg. This is another picture of Cape Town. In this instance, it's just trees. Just a series of tree ridges separate the white communities from the Black communities. And this juxtaposition of wealth and privilege and power and the lack of that is part of what really drives the violence in South Africa. It enrages people. And those photographs were of places near Johannesburg and Cape Town and urban areas. A similar phenomenon is happening out in the rural areas where they have farmland and vineyards, where Black Africans who are looking for housing and can't get it are now squatting on private land. And if they can stay there long enough, they can, by law, maintain this squatting settlement. So there's a movement by people who own the land to try to get those places destroyed and pushed off before they become permanent. But this all speaks to the fact that you have so many people with so little, and they've had so little for so long, even though apartheid's been gone for 25 plus years, and you have so much wealth that is so concentrated with so few people. That is a recipe for massive political unrest and chaos and anarchy. It just leads right up to it. It's a tinderbox. And one of the ways that the world pays attention to this is when a white farmer is murdered. And this happens around 100 to maybe 150 times a year. A white farmer is brutally assaulted and killed in South Africa. It can lead the news because it plays on the fears of any race that goes from majority to minority. And one of the leaders of this movement to take the land if by violence if necessary is Julius Malema, who used to be a high-ranking leader in the ANC and who was essentially kicked out of the ANC for being too aggressive and too violent in his rhetoric. And you can Google and YouTube videos of Julius Malema at rallies where he is calling for the aggressive taking of private white land and the redistribution of it to black farmers, and with violence if necessary. And there are a few people that strike more fear in the heart of whites in general and white farmers in South Africa than Julius Malema. Let me let you listen to what kind of response he invokes or calls out of white farmers in this video clip. This is the daughter of a white farmer.
Word dit geleer. So jy kan net so maklik leer om mense lief te hê. So ek dink dit verskil van huis tot huis en van mens tot mens hoe jy oor jou medemens voel. Toe ek op universiteit was, het ek heelwat swart vriende gehad en ek het nog kontak met sommige van hulle, maar dit is nie die kultuur dink ek verskil. Ek dink dit is meer 'n skeiding weens die kultuurverskil as kleurverskil. Dit is nie so en ek sou myself nie as 'n rasis beskou nie. So maar ek het nie dit is omstandighede wat 'n mens daartoe bly dat 'n mens meestal blanke vriende in die omgewing het.
She's speaking Afrikaans.
Do you believe that there's still a place for the whites in South Africa?
I think so. If you look at Africa do have one rule, and that's the survival of the fittest. And I can tell you, we will not disappear. We will stay. If there must be blood, there must be blood.
Can I ask you, I mean, apartheid was also a violent period. So isn't it, I mean, aren't you harvesting what you planted?
Say so.
Well, I mean...
No. That's part of the history. Everybody likes to talk about. When we came in here 300 odd years ago, there was bugger all in South Africa. Nothing. Not even a wheel. If there was a wheel or a wheelbarrow in South Africa, it would have changed the situation. But there was not even a wheel that was invented in South Africa. So, history. We are not scared about it. We have built up this country in 400 years, and they are running it down in 20 years. Sorry. Take north, up. What's left in the north? Nothing. You've been in the north.
You mean Zimbabwe?
Everywhere. Go on. North. It was rich countries. What's left? Poverty.
If you are an African, you would love other people, irrespective of their race, color, you know, and their language. You would actually get along with one another because Africa is such a huge continent, so much minerals and so much to give and so many people from different walks of life. So if you're gonna proudly call yourself an African, you might as well, you know, show why you are African.
And be nice to Africans.
Yeah, and just be nice to other Africans and live with them in harmony. You know, instead of studying civil wars and all sorts of stuff. There's still a lot to be done. You know, not enough has been done to build social cohesion in this country. You know, we still live in our own little territories and want to protect ourselves, you know, from each other. And it's really ridiculous in my point of view, but there's still a long way to go.
this video clip just shows the intractability of the situation, because even if there were enough funds, and South Africa has the money, just so much of it gets leached away in corruption. But even if they could just harness and gather all that money to pay full market value for the land, many farmers don't want to sell. That this is their life. This is what they know. It's farming and livestock and animals and orchards, and they just don't have another viable professional path they can pursue. And so, they're sometimes referred to as the bitter enders, but they literally don't see any other path. And so part of the problem is coming up with enough money and avoiding having it taken away through corruption to buy off this land at a reasonable market price and then redistribute it, but they don't want to sell. And then you also have the dilemma of, you don't have generations of South African Black farmers who have the experience, the financial capital, the resources to keep some of the farmland at the same productivity level that the white farmers have been able to generate over multiple generations. And so sometimes when that happens and the ownership of the land trades hands, the output of the farm drops significantly. And if that's done on a large enough scale, like has happened in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe went from being a food positive, food surplus country that had enough for its own people and then they could export, to, after they went through a very aggressive process of reclaiming land and redistributing it, they went to a position of food scarcity and they had to import food. So there's a practicality issue of, you have to maintain the consistent level of farm output to feed your people. So these are just the statistics. When the Natives Land Act was adopted in 1913, it awarded the ownership of 87% of the land to South Africans of European descent, right? So the vast majority of the land in South Africa was given to whites to farm and to use and to build an enormous amount of wealth. In 1994, when apartheid was ended, that had only dropped from 87 to 85%. It didn't change. I mean, from 1913 to 1994, for 80 years, there was no real change in white ownership of land, which is not surprising. And then in 2017, the last year they had accurate statistics, that 85% had only gone down to 73%. And now 73% of the farming land in South Africa is owned by 9% of the population, by whites. And so it's an issue and a problem that is very resistant to any kind of efficient change. It's just interesting when they track sentiments in all these countries and they ask them, the population in China and Saudi Arabia and India and all the way down to South Africa, is the country more on the right track, more on the wrong track? The Chinese one is kind of funny because you wonder how honest anyone could answer a public survey from a Western journalist, but it looks like the vast majority of the Chinese population think they're on the right track. India thinks the majority appears to be on, they thinking that they're on the right track. This is with earlier in the first administration of Narendra Modi. Japan is where you start to see the majority of the population inching towards being on the wrong track, and they're worried about poverty and social inequality. When this was taken in the fall of 2016, when Trump was elected, a majority of the Americans thought we were on the wrong track, and the biggest issue they were worried about was terrorism, which was an issue that Trump kept trumpeting many times, that we were, our country was under threat and under siege of different forms of terrorism. South Africa, the vast majority of the population believes they're on the wrong track, and financial and political corruption is the thing they're the most concerned about. The current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, is the fourth president in South Africa after Jacob Zuma, has been an ally in the ANC with Nelson Mandela for many decades. And when he was not the person chosen to be president after Mandela, he went into business and is one of the wealthiest businessmen, wealthiest individuals in South Africa. And his job now is to try to get after and address these long, simmering economic problems of widespread unemployment and lack of wealth redistribution. And he's always being pushed to more radical positions by Julius Malema, because Julius Malema criticizes both him and the ANC for being corrupt and sold out, and now more of the problem than the solution. And so whatever his own private views are, he continually gets pushed to more radical positions by the rhetoric of Julius Malema. Okay, you've seen this so many times in this class. It's probably one of the biggest themes of our class, this and incentives of Freakonomics. But as you know, from country to country to country, countries and societies and organizations that can secure the bottom two rungs of Maslow's hierarchy have a more content populace, a more stable politics, a more thriving middle class, and more people that can move up to these higher realms of what we all want: love, belonging, esteem, self-actualization. South Africa has struggled for many decades and continues to struggle to get the masses stable access to food, shelter, water, clothing, and safety and security. And this was most vividly illustrated this past 2 years in Cape Town, when Cape Town was on the verge of being the first place on the planet that ran out of water. Hard to believe and hard to imagine. But this is what it looked like. And just look at the way race and disparity still plays into an issue like water disparities.
At this point, the chance of reaching day zero is now very likely. We can no longer ask people to stop wasting water. We now have to force them.
Anything, officer? Need some backup here.
Level 6B water restrictions where you are not allowed to use the municipal drinking water for anything else except drinking. You cannot wash your car, you cannot water your garden. Be 2 minutes away from some illegal powers. You can drive behind the quantum. We don't want to alert them.
He's being arrested for washing cars with a big bucket of water. That bucket of water got him arrested.
You know, like they say, they need to put something on the table. If you take away my car wash, what do you expect me to do? You want me to break in? Do you want me to rob the people on the street? Yeah, I'm doing an honest living. And you're taking this away also. So yeah, let's feel a little bit bad about that.
Look at the contrast.
Those are mine, and those are big. Come on.
city must fall. Whoever will fall or the city must fall. Party, Cape Town, party. You cannot make a profit out of water. Water is necessary for life. It doesn't mean if you don't have money, you can't get water. No, we must provide water for everybody, and it must be free. Party, Cape Town, party.
Water crisis, man. Do you see any rich white people suffering from a water shortage? Huh? Say it with me. On to those overpriced hotels down the road. You can run that bath water until it floods. There's no water crisis there. But I bet you've got no water in your house. I bet you've got no water in your house.
Ma'am, is this hose pipe, is it connected to your tap or what is it connected?
The pipe to the water.
Do you mind opening for me, please?
Nee, ons gebruik die water wat ons gebruik vir ons.
And sometime other today you've watered the garden because you've seen
Nee, man, dis nie
water in, not today.
Dis 'n vetplant. Vetplante hou langer water.
So when would you use your bowl?
When I need water for the toilet.
So you put it in the containers and you use it for your system. Well, that's it. Well, that's well saved water. Yeah.
Are you going to eat some of the houses now? Because all these houses got balls, eh? Next door and next door.
I love gardening, and I've lost a lot in my garden with this drought. Heartbreaking to watch it all die.
Repentance! Repentance means coming back to God. I will open rivers in high places and fountains in the midst of the valley. God is speaking to you, South Africa. Amen. I am a consuming fire. No repentance, no salvation. No repentance, no life. Fighting God. Give our sins, bring rain to the land. First the spiritual, and then the rain's coming. Plenty rain.
And I pray in the name of Jesus, Father, that my father will come back to church, that my father will turn to you, Father. Thank you, Lord.
Believe in our heart, God. We can heal, God. I shake it up, God. No, you God. Now, don't shake it, God. We thank you right now for revival, Father God. We thank you this afternoon, Lord. We thank you, Lord.
You have stopped screen share.